Picture this alone figure walking along an endless shoreline, the wind moving gently, the ocean breathing in and out, and the man suddenly stopping not because he is tired, but because he realizes he has been walking his whole life only to arrive exactly here old, and yet strangely new. You see, we tend to imagine aging as a kind of loss, the loss of strength, the loss of memory, the loss of time. But what if growing old is not something that is happening to you, but something that is finally revealing you? Because the curious thing is that when you were young, you were always in a hurry to become someone, to arrive somewhere, to prove something, and now as the years fall away like dry leaves in a quiet wind, you begin to notice that there was never anyone you needed to become in the first place, and so a question quietly emerges, not loudly, but like a whisper carried across a wide landscape. What does it mean to grow old when time stretches out like a desert, where the sky feels older than memory itself, and where silence seems to speak more honestly than words ever could? Is aging truly a decline, or is it, in a very subtle and paradoxical way, a return? There is something peculiar about growing old, because time does not behave the way we expect it to. It does not rush forward with urgency, but instead expands, opens, and lingers, much like a vast open land that appears empty at first glance, yet holds a depth that cannot be measured. As the body begins to slow, as steps become more deliberate and breath more noticeable, you start to become aware of things you once ignored: the slight ache in the joints, the pause between movements, the silence between thoughts, and what once felt like limitation begins to reveal itself as something else entirely. This slowing down is not a failure, not a breaking apart, but an invitation, because when movement fades, awareness sharpens, and what you lose in speed you gain in depth. And then there is memory, that curious and unreliable companion which begins to loosen its grip as you grow older. Names slip away, dates dissolve, and the stories you once held so tightly begin to blur at the edges. And at first this feels unsettling, even frightening, as though you are losing pieces of yourself. But then, quite unexpectedly, something shifts as memory softens. You are no longer held captive by the past, no longer bound to the identities you once carried so seriously. You are no longer only the child you were, or the ambitious young person striving toward some imagined future, or the version of yourself that needed validation or certainty. Instead, you find yourself simply here, present in a way that feels both unfamiliar and deeply natural. And within that simple presence there is a quiet freedom, a lightness that does not come from gaining more, but from needing less. We fear aging, you see, because we believe that we are something solid, something fixed, something that exists as a stable entity moving through time. And so, as the years pass, it feels as though that entity is being gradually erased. But if you look closely, if you truly examine your experience, you may begin to notice that you are never as solid as you imagine. The person you were at 20 is no longer here. The one you were at 30 has also disappeared. And yet something remains, not a fixed thing, not a permanent identity, but a process, a movement, a flowing, something much more like a river than a statue. You are not a thing that ages, you are an event that is unfolding, just as the ocean is not a single wave, but the continuous arising and dissolving of waves, never the same and yet never separate from itself. And so when we say I am getting old, what we are really pointing to is the gradual dissolution of the illusion of permanence. And this dissolution can feel like death, because it strips away the sense of control, the sense of continuity, the comforting idea that there is something we can hold on to. But this is not death in the way we fear it. It is not an ending in the catastrophic sense, but rather a revealing, a clarification, a gentle unveiling of the way things have always been. Life was never something you could possess, never something you could fix in place, and aging simply makes this truth impossible to ignore. To grow old, then, is to become transparent to life, to stop resisting the natural movement of things, to stop chasing after what cannot be held, and to begin, perhaps for the first time, to feel the rhythm of existence itself, the rhythm of rising and falling, of coming and going, of being and not being. This rhythm is everywhere, in the tides that advance and retreat without hesitation, in the seasons that shift without asking permission, and in the long empty roads that stretch endlessly forward, not leading anywhere in particular, but simply existing as a path. And gradually, almost without noticing, you begin to understand something that once seemed impossible to grasp. Life was never going anywhere. It was never a journey toward a final destination. It was always a dance, a movement without a fixed endpoint, so here you are older now, perhaps quieter, perhaps less visible to the world that once demanded your attention, and yet there is a subtle shift taking place within you because for the first time you may no longer feel the need to be remembered, no longer feel compelled to leave a mark, no longer feel that your existence must justify itself, and in that letting go, in that quiet surrender, there is a kind of peace that does not come from achievement or success, but from the simple act of no longer struggling against the flow of things. It is the peace of stopping not in defeat, but in understanding, like the ocean at dusk when the surface appears still yet continues its endless motion beneath, like the wind that moves without needing to prove that it is moving at all, you and not running out of time. You are falling into it, dissolving into the very thing you once believed was slipping away from you, and in that realization lies a secret so simple and yet so profound that it changes everything without changing anything at all, and as you fall into it, something even more subtle begins to unfold, something that cannot quite be grasped by thought and yet feels undeniably real, because what you begin to notice is not just that time is passing, but that the one who believed he was inside time was never separate from it in the first place, and this realization does not arrive as a dramatic revelation, it comes quietly, almost shyly. Like the soft glow of evening light stretching across the Australian landscape where shadows grow long and the world does not end but simply deepens, and you begin to see that what you once called your life was never a straight line moving from beginning to end, but more like a vast open field in which moments appear and disappear without ever truly belonging to anyone. And this is why as you grow older there is a strange sense that things are both slipping away and becoming clearer at the same time, because what is slipping away is the illusion that you were ever in control, and what is becoming clearer is the simple undeniable fact that life has always been living itself through you rather than the other way around, and this can feel unsettling at first because it removes the familiar ground beneath your feet, the idea that you are the author of your story, the one who decides the direction, the meaning, the outcome, but then something else emerges, something softer and infinitely more spacious, a sense that you do not need to control the river in order to be carried by it, and in a place like Australia where the land itself seems to stretch beyond human intention, this becomes almost impossible to ignore, because here you can stand in the middle of an immense silence and realize that nothing is asking you to be anything other than what you already are. The wind does not hurry the ocean, does not cling to its waves, the sky does not try to hold onto the clouds, and yet everything continues perfectly without effort. And so as the years pass and the body continues its gentle transformation, you may begin to feel less like a separate observer moving through the world, and more like an expression of the world itself, as if the boundary between you and everything else has become more transparent, less rigid, less convincing. And this is where the fear of aging begins to dissolve, not because you have found a way to escape it, but because you have seen through the assumption that there was ever anything to escape from in the first place, because what you called aging was simply change, and what you called yourself was simply a pattern within that change. And when the pattern shifts, when the energy moves in a different way, there is no tragedy in it unless you insist that it should have remained the same, and this insistence, this subtle resistance, is what creates the tension, the anxiety, the quiet sense that something is being taken from you. But if you let go of that insistence even for a moment, you may notice something quite extraordinary, that nothing essential has been lost, because there was never anything essential to lose, only forms changing shapes, dissolving and reappearing in an endless dance. And this is why the later years of life can carry a depth that youth cannot quite access, not because they are better or more meaningful, but because they reveal a dimension of experience that is hidden by the urgency of becoming. Because when you are young, you are occupied with the future, with what might be, with what should be, and in that movement forward you overlook what is already here. But as you grow older and the future begins to shorten, not in a frightening way, but in a clarifying one, you are gently returned to the immediacy of the present, not as an idea, not as a technique, but as a lived reality, because there is nowhere else to go and nothing else to become, and in that realization there is a kind of intimacy with life that cannot be manufactured, an Intimacy that feels like coming home to something you never actually left, and perhaps this is why there is a quiet beauty in old age that is often misunderstood, because from the outside it may appear as decline, as fading, as the gradual disappearance of vitality, but from within it can feel like a softening of boundaries, a deepening of perception, a release from the constant pressure to define and defend who you are, and instead there is space to observe, space to feel, space to simply be, without the need to turn experience into something useful or meaningful. And this is not emptiness in the sense of lack, it is emptiness in the sense of openness, like the vast Australian sky that holds everything without holding on to anything. And in this openness there is a freedom that does not depend on youth or strength or memory. It is a freedom that comes from no longer needing to be someone in particular, no longer needing to secure your place in the story of the world. And so as the sun sets on the horizon and the light fades into a quiet stillness, you may begin to sense that nothing is truly ending, that what you called your life is not closing but unfolding in a different way, less defined, less graspable, and yet somehow more complete. And in that quiet completeness there is nothing left to achieve, nothing left to prove, only this simple and profound movement of existence happening as it always has and always will, and you are not separate from it. You never were. You are that movement itself, appearing for a time as a person walking along a shoreline, and now slowly dissolving back into the vastness from which you came, not as a loss, not as a failure, but as a return, so natural, so effortless that it has been happening all along without you ever needing to notice it at all. And as this quiet understanding settles more deeply within you, there is no sudden transformation, no dramatic shift that announces itself as enlightenment, but rather a gentle easing, as though something within you has finally exhaled after holding its breath for a very long time. And in that exhale you begin to sense that what you once called your life was never something you needed to manage or direct. It was something that was always unfolding perfectly in its own way, even in moments that once seemed confusing or painful, because those two were part of the same movement, the same rhythm that now reveals itself not as chaos but as a kind of hidden harmony. And this harmony is not something you impose upon the world, it is something you begin to notice when you stop trying to rearrange it, because for so long you believed that meaning was something you had to create, something you had to build through effort, through decisions, through control. But now as the layers of that belief begin to soften, you may start to see that meaning was never separate from the experience itself. It was never something added on top of life. It was inherent within it, present in the very act of being here, of seeing, of hearing, of feeling, without the constant need to interpret or evaluate. And this is why the later years can carry such a quiet richness, because they are no longer driven by the same urgency to extract something from each moment to turn it into progress or achievement, and instead there is a willingness to let the moment be exactly what it is, whether it is filled with sound or silence, activity or stillness. And in that willingness there is a kind of openness that was perhaps always available but rarely noticed, because the mind was so occupied with moving forward, with reaching for what comes next, that it overlooked the depth of what was already present. And so now as the sense of future becomes less dominant, not as a loss but as a natural shift in perspective, you are gently drawn back into the immediacy of life, not as an idea, not as something to practice, but as the only place where anything has ever truly existed. And in this immediacy there is a subtle yet profound shift in how you experience yourself, because the boundaries that once felt so clear, so defined, begin to soften, and what you once called me no longer feels separate from what you once called the world. And this is not a philosophical conclusion, it is a lived sensation, a quiet recognition that the same movement that shapes the wind, that moves the ocean, that carries the clouds across the sky, is the very same movement that you have always been. And as this recognition deepens, the fear of disappearance, the fear of fading away, begins to lose its grip, because you start to see that what you truly are cannot disappear in the way you once imagined, because it was never a fixed object that could be lost. It was always this dynamic unfolding, this continuous expression of life itself. And so what you once feared as an ending reveals itself as a transformation, not into something else, but into the same process in a different form, like the way a wave returns to the ocean, not as a loss, but as a continuation of what it always was. And in this way, the idea of death itself begins to shift not as something to be denied or escaped, but as part of the same rhythm that has been present from the very beginning, because every moment has always been a kind of ending, and a beginning at the same time, each breath appearing and disappearing, each thought arising and dissolving, and yet through all of this there is a continuity not of identity, but of being a seamless flow that cannot be divided into separate pieces, and as you begin to feel this more directly, not as a concept, but as an experience, the need to hold on to life, to preserve it, to extend it begins to soften, because you are no longer standing apart from it, trying to secure your place within it. You are it, you have always been it. And this realization does not remove the natural sensations of aging, the changes in the body, the shifts in energy, the quiet fading of certain abilities, but it changes the way those sensations are experienced, because they are no longer interpreted as something happening to you. They are simply part of the same unfolding, the same dance of existence expressing itself through form and time, and so instead of resisting them, instead of wishing for them to be otherwise, there is a kind of gentle curiosity, a willingness to feel them fully, to allow them to be as they are without adding the extra layer of struggle that comes from the belief that things should be different, and in this allowing there is a peace that is not dependent on circumstances, not dependent on youth or strength or clarity of memory, but arises naturally from the absence of resistance, from the simple act of being present with what is. And as this presence deepens even further, you may begin to notice that there is nothing missing, nothing incomplete, nothing waiting to be resolved, because the sense of incompleteness was always tied to the idea that you were separate from life, moving towards some future state where everything would finally make sense. But now that movement toward has begun to dissolve, and what remains is this simple immediate completeness, not as a conclusion, but as a living reality, something that cannot be held or described, but only experienced directly. And in that experience there is a quiet sense of wonder, not the wonder of discovering something new, but the wonder of recognizing something that has always been here, something so close, so immediate that it was easily overlooked. And now as the light continues to soften and the day gradually gives way to evening, there is no need to reach for anything beyond this moment, no need to secure what comes next, because what comes next is simply another expression of the same movement, the same mystery unfolding in its own way, and you are not separate from it, you never were. And so as everything continues to change, as it always has, there is a quiet stillness at the heart of it all, not a stillness that opposes movement, but one that exists within it, like the silent depth beneath the surface of the ocean, unchanged by the waves that rise and fall above. And in resting within that stillness there is nothing left to seek, nothing left to become, only this endless gentle unfolding of life as it is and always has been, complete in its incompleteness, whole in its constant change, and infinitely present in every moment that arises and fades without ever truly leaving it all. And in this endless unfolding there comes a point where even the idea of reaching a point begins to dissolve. Because you see, there was never a destination waiting for you at the end of time, there was only ever this quiet immediacy, this simple undeniable presence that has been here through every stage of your life unnoticed, not because it was hidden, but because it was too obvious, too close, too intimately woven into everything you experienced. And now as the layers of striving and seeking fall away like old leaves returning to the earth, you begin to sense that what you are is not something that can be improved or diminished. It is not something that grows or declines in the way the body does. It is something far more subtle, far more fluid, something that was never born and therefore does not age in the way you once imagined. And this is not a belief to hold on to. It is something that reveals itself quietly when you are no longer trying to define yourself through memory, through achievement, through the story you have been telling about who you are, because that story, like all stories, has always been in motion, constantly shifting, constantly rewriting itself, and yet you are not confined to it. You are the space in which it appears, the awareness in which it moves. And as this becomes more apparent, not through effort, but through the simple softening of resistance, there is a profound lightness that begins to permeate your experience, not because life has become easier, but because you are no longer carrying the burden of needing it to be something other than what it is. And so even the changes that come with age, the slow, quiet transformations of the body, the subtle fading of certain abilities, the deepening of stillness within the mind, are no longer seen as obstacles or problems to overcome, but as natural expressions of the same rhythm that has always been present, the same rhythm that moves the tide, shapes the land, and carries the seasons effortlessly from one to the next. And in this recognition, there is a kind of trust, not a belief that everything will turn out a certain way, but a deeper trust in the movement itself, a trust that does not depend on outcomes or expectations, but arises from the simple seeing that life has always unfolded without your control, and yet here it is, still moving, still breathing, still expressing itself in ways that cannot be predicted or contained. And so as you sit perhaps in the quiet of an Australian evening, the sky vast and open, the air carrying a softness that cannot quite be described, you may begin to feel that you are not separate from this vastness. You are not a small isolated self looking out at a world that surrounds you. You are that world experiencing itself from a particular point of view, and this point of view, which you once called me, is not fixed, it is not permanent, it is a temporary expression, a perspective that arises and fades just like everything else, and this is not something to fear, because what you truly are is not limited to that perspective. It is the whole movement within which that perspective appears and disappears, and so the idea of losing yourself, of fading away, of coming to an end begins to lose its meaning, because you are never confined to the form you identified with, you are never contained within the boundaries you believe defined you. And as those boundaries soften, as they naturally do with time, there is a sense not of loss, but of expansion, not into something new, but into what has always been present, a vast open field of being that cannot be measured or defined, and within this field there is no separation between beginning and ending, between youth and age, between life and what you once called death. There is only this continuous movement, this dance of appearing and disappearing that has no fixed center, no final conclusion. And in resting within this understanding, there is a peace that does not depend on certainty, does not depend on permanence, but arises from the simple acceptance of change as the very nature of existence itself. And so the journey you once believed you were on the path you thought you had to follow, the destination you imagined you would one day reach, all of these begin to fade, not because they were wrong, but because they were never as solid as they seemed. They were part of the play, part of the movement, part of the unfolding that you are now beginning to see more clearly. And in that clarity there is nothing left to grasp, nothing left to hold, only this gentle ongoing expression of life as it is and always has been. And as the final light of day slips quietly beyond the horizon and the world settles into a stillness that is not empty but full beyond measure, you may find yourself resting not in the idea of who you are or where you have been, but in the simple fact of being itself. And in that resting there is no fear, no urgency, no sense of something missing, only this quiet, boundless presence unfolding endlessly, without beginning, without end, and without ever needing to be anything other than exactly what it isn't. In this quiet, boundless presence there is something so subtle that it can easily be overlooked even now, because the mind still searches for something more, something beyond this moment, something that might complete the picture or finally bring a sense of arrival. But what you begin to notice as this searching softens is that the very act of looking away from what is here has always been the only thing that obscured it, because there was never anything missing, there was only the habit of imagining that something was missing, and as that habit gently dissolves, what remains is not an answer, not a conclusion, but a kind of silent clarity, a recognition without words that this is it, this has always been it, not as a statement, not as a belief, but as something so immediate that it does not need to be confirmed. And in this immediacy, there is a strange and beautiful simplicity, because nothing needs to be added, nothing needs to be removed, there is no improvement required, no correction to be made, there is only this unfolding, this gentle movement of life expressing itself as sensation, as sound, as thought, as stillness, and you are not separate from any of it. You are not standing outside observing it. You are that very movement appearing as a moment of awareness within itself. And as this becomes more and more obvious, not through effort, but through the quiet fading of resistance, there is a deep relaxation that begins to permeate everything, not a relaxation that comes from achieving something, but one that comes from no longer needing to achieve anything at all, and in that relaxation, even the idea of understanding begins to fall away, because what is there to understand when there is no separation between the one who understands and the thing to be understood? There is only this seamless flow, this indivisible happening that cannot be broken into parts without losing its essence, and so the need to grasp it, to define it, to hold it within the boundaries of thought begins to lose its urgency, and what remains is a kind of wordless intimacy with life itself, an intimacy that does not depend on knowledge or explanation, but arises naturally when there is nothing standing in the way. And perhaps this is what growing old has been quietly offering all along, not a diminishing, not a closing down, but a gradual clearing, a gentle stripping away of what is unnecessary, what is artificial, what is based on the illusion of separation. And as those layers fall away, what is revealed is not something new, but something that has always been here, something so simple, so immediate that it was easily overlooked in the rush of becoming, and now as that rush comes to rest, there is space to see it, to feel it, to be it without effort, without intention, and in that space there is a kind of peace that is not fragile, not dependent on circumstances, not threatened by change, because it does not come from holding on, it comes from the absence of holding on, it comes from the recognition that there is nothing to lose because there was never anything separate to begin with. And so even as the body continues its natural course, even as time unfolds in its own way, there is no longer a sense of being carried toward an ending. There is only this continuous present, this ever-renewing now that does not move from past to future, but simply appears and disappears in an endless rhythm. And in resting within this rhythm, there is a quiet joy, not the kind that seeks expression or validation, but one that exists quietly beneath the surface of everything, like a gentle hum that does not begin and does not end. And as you sit within this, perhaps watching the night settle in, perhaps listening to the distant sounds that rise and fade without effort, you may begin to notice that nothing needs to be different, nothing needs to be resolved, because everything is already complete in its incompleteness, whole in its constant change. And so there is nothing left to reach for, nothing left to avoid, only this simple, undeniable presence unfolding endlessly, without direction, without destination, and without ever stepping outside of itself. And in that realization, so quiet, so unassuming that it could easily be missed, lies a freedom that cannot be taken away because it was never given. It is the freedom of being what you are without needing to know what that is. And in that not knowing, there is a vast openness, a silence that is not empty but alive with everything that has ever been and ever will be. And you are not apart from it, you are not contained within it, you are it, and always have been, appearing now as this moment, and just as effortlessly dissolving back into the same mystery from which it arose, without loss, without gain, without beginning, without end, only this endless gentle unfolding that has no name and needs none at all. And so in the quiet that follows this realization, there is no need to conclude anything, no need to arrive at a final understanding, because what you are begins to feel too vast, too fluid to be contained within any conclusion at all, and instead there is only this gentle settling, as though everything has found its natural place, without effort, without force, without intention. And in that settling you may begin to notice something almost imperceptible at first, a deep and quiet ease, not the kind that comes from solving problems or reaching goals, but the kind that was always present beneath the noise of becoming and striving. And now as that noise fades, what remains is not emptiness in the sense of absence, but emptiness in the sense of openness, a boundless space in which everything appears and disappears freely without needing to be held. And in this openness, even the idea of time begins to lose its sharp edges, because you are no longer measuring your life in terms of what has passed or what is yet to come. You are simply here, where everything has always been unfolding, and so the fear of running out of time gently dissolves, not because time has stopped, but because you are no longer separate from it. You are moving with it, as though you have always been the current rather than something carried by it. And in this movement there is no resistance, no struggle, no sense of something slipping away, because nothing is being taken from you, only forms changing shapes, dissolving and reappearing in ways that were never yours to control. And so what once felt like an ending reveals itself as a continuation, not of the story you told about yourself, but of the life that was always larger than That story, and as this becomes clear, there is nothing left to hold on to and nothing left to let go of, because holding on and letting go were always part of the same illusion, the idea that there was something separate to grasp in the first place, and now even that idea begins to fade, leaving only this simple undivided experience of being where everything is already complete, not in a static sense, but in a living, moving sense, whole in its constant change, perfect in its imperfection, and as you rest in this without trying to name it, without trying to understand it, you may find that what you once called yourself has become transparent, like a window through which life looks at itself, and in that transparency there is no longer a center, no longer a boundary, only this vast gentle unfolding that has no beginning, no end, and no need to be anything other than exactly what it is, and in that there is a peace so quiet, so effortless that it could easily be missed, and yet once felt it cannot be forgotten, not because you hold on to it, but because it was never separate from you to begin with. It is simply what remains when everything else has fallen away, and in that remaining there is nothing left to seek, nothing left to become, only this endless silent fullness expressing itself as this moment, and then dissolving again just as softly into the mystery from which it came, without loss, without gain, without conclusion, and without ever truly ending at all.